On a Tuesday morning in October, a moving truck backed into the driveway of a house on Larch Street, and by the time the sun went down, a life that had stood there for 46 years was gone. Boxes came out first, then furniture, then the small, useless things nobody thinks to save until it's too late. A chipped mug, a stack of church bulletins, a calendar still turned to a month that had already passed. By the front door, untouched, sat a pair of worn leather slippers, waiting for feet that weren't coming home that day. The man who built this house with his own 2 hands was 2 miles away, in a room with a hospital bed and a window that didn't open, with no idea any of this was happening. That man's name was Frank Whitmore. He was 78, still alive, still the legal owner of the house being emptied out behind his back. The man who signed the papers that morning, handing over 46 years of his father's life for $410,000, was his own son, Daniel. He believed he'd thought of everything. What he hadn't counted on was a letter his mother sealed away 6 years before she died, waiting for this exact moment. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a son ends up selling his own father's house, while that father is still breathing, you have to go back nearly 50 years to a young man named Frank Whitmore, coming home from the army with steady hands, a head full of plans, and almost nothing in his pocket. In 1971, he married a woman named Eleanor Hayes, and 3 years later, with a small bank loan and a truck he'd borrowed from a friend, Frank built her a house on Larch Street with his own 2 hands, working nights under floodlights after finishing his regular job just to get it done. He used to tell people it didn't need to be big, it just needed to be theirs. And by the time he hammered in the last nail, every board in that house carried some part of him inside it. That house held their whole life. The staircase Frank carved by hand, the same winter their son Daniel was born. The kitchen he rebuilt from scratch, alone, the year Eleanor was diagnosed with cancer, because she told him she wanted to face whatever came next, somewhere that still looked exactly like the day they'd moved in. Eleanor died in that house 6 years before this story begins, and Frank never left it afterward, not for a single night. Her reading glasses stayed on the windowsill. Her handwriting stayed on the recipe cards in the kitchen drawer. Her coat stayed hanging on the hook by the door, because taking it down felt, to Frank, like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. Daniel grew up inside those walls too. He was the star of his high school football team, the first person in the family to run his own business, and for years, he genuinely modeled himself after the father he idolized, building a contracting company, in some ways as a tribute to the man who'd taught him how to swing a hammer before he was old enough to drive. But somewhere between his father's generation and his own, something in Daniel started to shift, quietly, in a way nobody around him noticed at first, because he was very good at making sure nobody noticed. He wasn't building things anymore by the time this story really starts. He was managing losses and hiding them from everyone who loved him, including himself. 3 hours away, in Columbus, Frank's daughter Claire Whitmore Hayes had already stopped expecting anything different from her brother. She worked as a hospice nurse. She was sharp, she was guarded, and after a bitter falling out 3 years earlier over who would cover the cost of their mother's funeral, she and Daniel hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to each other. Claire used to tell friends that Danny always had a good excuse ready, and that with him, the excuse was usually more polished than the truth ever was. None of them, not Frank, not Claire, not even Daniel's own wife Marla, understood yet just how far that gap between excuse and truth was about to stretch, or what it was going to cost all of them before this was finished. 18 months before that moving truck ever pulled into the driveway on Larch Street, Whitmore Contracting collapsed completely. A business partnership had turned sour, a lawsuit had gone against him, and underneath all of it sat something Daniel had kept hidden for years, a gambling habit that had quietly eaten through every financial safety net he'd ever built for himself. He owed close to $187,000 by the time this story truly begins, and he had told almost no one the real number, not his father, and not even Marla, who suspected far more than he ever admitted to her directly. Marla later said that Danny told her it was temporary, that the business would bounce back once they got through the winter, and that she believed him, mostly because she wanted so badly for it to be true. Around that same stretch of time, Frank's memory had begun slipping in small, forgivable ways. He'd misplace his keys. He'd forget a doctor's appointment he'd written down himself. He'd tell the same story twice in 1 week without realizing he'd already told it. None of it was dramatic on its own, but it was exactly the kind of thing a devoted son might notice first, and exactly the kind of thing a desperate son might quietly decide to use. Daniel started visiting more often after that, and every visit came with a folder tucked under his arm, though for the first few weeks, he never once mentioned what was actually inside it. He would sit across from his father and talk gently about how the stairs at Larch Street weren't safe anymore, how a place where somebody checked on him regularly would take the pressure off everyone, how it would only be for a little while, just until Frank felt steadier on his feet again. Frank would remind him that this was his house, that it was Eleanor's house, and Daniel would agree, telling him nobody was talking about the house at all. The truth was that he was already talking about the house. He simply hadn't said the words out loud yet, and 3 weeks later, Frank moved into a place called Cedarbrook Senior Living, believing, the way his son had told him to believe, that it was only temporary. It would turn out to be the last night Frank Whitmore ever slept under his own roof, for a very long time. To sell a house that isn't legally yours, you need signing authority, and Daniel knew that an outright forgery would be far too reckless to risk. So instead, he did something quieter, and in its own way something worse. He waited for a hard day, during a difficult week, and brought his father a stack of papers, describing it simply as some paperwork to help manage things while he settled in at Cedarbrook. He told Frank that their family lawyer, a man named Roger Aldis, who had handled their affairs for 30 years, happened to be out sick that particular week, which wasn't true at all, because Roger had never even been asked. Daniel had instead found a different notary through an old contracting contact, someone willing to process the signature without asking too many questions about why it was needed. Frank signed it the same way he had signed 100 contractor invoices across his lifetime, trusting the man placing the pen in his hand, because that man happened to be his own son. Within a week, a for sale sign had been staked into the front lawn of 214 Larch Street, the very same lawn Frank had reseeded by hand every single spring for 46 consecutive years. A neighbor walking past paused on the sidewalk and quietly wondered aloud whether Frank even knew about any of this, but nobody actually asked him, and Frank, sitting 3 miles away in a room that wasn't his, behind a window that didn't open, had absolutely no idea that his house now had a price tag attached to it. Within 4 weeks, an investor named Vincent Cho, who bought and renovated homes across 3 counties for a living, made an offer on the property, and Daniel didn't hesitate for even a moment. Vincent offered $410,000 in cash with a 30-day close, and mentioned that he didn't need the actual seller present for any part of the process, since the power of attorney would cover exactly that. Daniel agreed immediately, telling himself it was simply how these things were done. It was, without question, the fastest and easiest sale he had ever closed in his entire career, and it was also, though he wasn't willing to admit it to himself yet, the very first real crime he had ever committed. The sale closed on a Tuesday morning, and by that same afternoon, the house Frank Whitmore had built for his wife, with his own hands, belonged, on paper, to a complete stranger. Frank found out 3 days later, not from his son, but from a Cedarbrook aide who mentioned in passing that she'd heard his old place on Larch Street had sold remarkably fast. Frank asked her, quietly. Sold to who? And the aide, realizing too late what she'd just given away, apologized and admitted she'd assumed he already knew. Frank called Daniel 4 times that day. Daniel didn't answer a single one of those calls. So Frank called his daughter instead, and for the first time in over 3 years, Claire heard her father's voice on the other end of the phone, shaking, asking her if she understood what was happening to his house, because he certainly didn't. Claire drove 3 hours that same night, without stopping. What waited for her when she arrived wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a phone call. It was her father's own signature, sitting on a power of attorney document he barely remembered agreeing to at all. Standing in that parking lot near midnight, Claire called Marla directly and asked her, point blank, whether Daniel had known their father didn't fully understand what he was signing that day. Marla had wondered the exact same thing for weeks by then, and for the first time, she finally said it out loud, admitting that Danny had told her it would fix everything, but had never once explained to her how. While all of this was unfolding, 2 miles away, Vincent Cho's renovation crew had already begun tearing into the kitchen Frank had rebuilt with his own hands for Eleanor after her diagnosis. The cabinets he had personally refinished went into a dumpster, parked in the driveway on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, along with the countertop she used to lean against while she read the newspaper aloud to him every morning. Piece by piece, the house that had held their entire life together was being erased, and Frank, still the true legal owner according to a deed nobody involved had bothered to check closely, was left to watch all of it happen from a window that didn't open, unable to do a single thing to stop it. 4 days after the sale closed, Daniel finally worked up the nerve to visit his father at Cedarbrook. He'd rehearsed exactly what he planned to say for the entire drive over, but none of it survived the moment he actually stepped into that room. Frank was sitting by the window, and he didn't even turn around when his son walked in. He told Daniel he'd spent 4 days trying to build him an explanation in his head, and that he was tired of doing it for him. When Daniel tried to start explaining anyway, Frank cut him off, telling him not to speak to him like he was some customer he was closing a deal with, reminding him that he was the one who'd taught Daniel how to frame a house and how to shake a man's hand and actually mean it, and asking him, plainly, to either tell him the truth or say nothing at all. There was a long, heavy silence in that room, long enough that for the very first time, Daniel had nothing left to hide behind. No folder, no rehearsed explanation, nothing but the plain reality of what he had actually done, sitting right there in front of him. He finally admitted that he'd owed people real money, more than he'd ever let his father know, and that he hadn't seen any other way to fix it without Frank discovering just how deep the trouble had gotten. Frank asked him quietly whether that meant he'd decided it was easier to sell his own mother's kitchen than it was to simply tell his father he was drowning. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't have to. What he said next is, according to Claire, the sentence that would end up haunting Daniel far more than any legal letter ever could, when Frank told him he would have sold the house himself and handed him every last dollar of it, if only he'd asked his own father instead of asking a stranger's lawyer to trick him out of it. That same night, the stress of everything finally caught up with Frank's heart, and he was rushed to Millbrook General with chest pains just after 11 at night. Claire stayed at his bedside until morning, refusing to leave his side for even a minute, while Daniel sat alone in the hallway outside, unable to bring himself to walk in, and equally unable to make himself leave. It was in that same hospital hallway, at nearly 2 in the morning, that Claire finally placed a phone call that would change absolutely everything that came after it, to Roger Aldous, the family's lawyer for 30 years, a man who, as it turned out, had already been trying to reach the Whitmore family for 4 straight days. Roger had heard about the sale only 2 days after it closed, through the county recorder's office, where he himself had quietly filed a document 20 years earlier that he had genuinely hoped would never need to be used at all. he told Claire, urgently, to bring her father in the very moment he was stable enough, because there was something her mother had left behind for exactly this kind of situation, something that had been sitting locked in his office, safe since the year 2004. Inside that safe was a sealed envelope with Eleanor Whitmore's handwriting across the front, instructing that it only be opened under one specific set of circumstances. 16 years before she died, Eleanor had walked into Roger's office alone, without telling Frank, because she had noticed something in Daniel even back then, a pattern of borrowing, of shortcuts, of promises that quietly went unkept. She never once shared her suspicions with Frank, not wanting to poison his relationship with his own son over a feeling she couldn't fully prove. But she wasn't willing to leave the house unprotected either. Roger still remembered her exact words from that meeting, that she loved her son deeply, but that she also knew precisely what he was capable of if he ever became desperate enough, and that she wanted a lock placed on that house that could only be opened if both of her children agreed to it, not one of them acting alone. What Eleanor had actually done was file a legal restriction directly onto the deed itself, a joint consent clause requiring both Daniel and Claire's written agreement before the house could ever be sold while Frank was still alive. It had sat there quietly on public record for 20 full years, essentially invisible unless someone specifically knew to look for it. Daniel's notary never found it. Vincent Cho's title company never found it either, a routine gap in a rush title search that, under any normal circumstances, might have let the entire scheme slide through completely unnoticed. But Roger Aldous had personally drafted that clause, and Roger Aldous had been quietly waiting, all these years, for the exact day someone finally tried to use that house the way Daniel just had. When Frank was finally stable enough to sit in Roger's office, Roger opened that decades-old envelope in front of him and read Eleanor's words aloud for the first time. She had written that if Frank was ever reading this letter, it meant one of two things. Either she was gone and he was simply an old man missing her terribly, or someone had tried to take the house out from under him and Roger had been forced to use the protection she'd quietly put in place. She wrote that she hoped, with everything in her, it was only the first reason, and that if it turned out to be the second, she was deeply sorry she had never told him what she'd once seen in their son. She asked him to protect their boy anyway, but to protect the house first, because it had always belonged to both of their children to decide together, never to just one of them alone. That single letter meant one clear and complete thing under the law, that Daniel had never actually possessed the authority to sell that house in the first place, not with a power of attorney, not with a confused and trusting signature from his own father, and certainly not without Claire's consent, which absolutely no one had ever thought to ask for. The sale to Vincent Cho was void from the very moment it had closed, as though, legally speaking, it had never truly happened at all. Vincent Cho, sitting across the table from Roger and Claire days later, was genuinely blindsided by the news, insisting he had purchased that property entirely in good faith and had already sunk $30,000 into renovations before anyone told him a single word about it. Roger assured him calmly that he would be made completely whole, every dollar refunded along with documented renovation costs, but that what he would not be doing was keeping a house he had, in the strictest legal sense, never actually been sold in the first place. Within 3 weeks, the entire sale was formally unwound, Vincent was reimbursed in full, and the deed reverted back to Frank Whitmore, exactly as it had stood the day before his son ever picked up that folder and walked through his door with it. Daniel was never criminally charged, because Frank, at his own explicit request, asked Roger not to pursue elder fraud charges through the county prosecutor, a decision that genuinely surprised nearly everyone who had followed the situation closely, including Claire herself. When Claire pushed back, reminding her father that Daniel could have taken absolutely everything they had, everything he and their mother had spent a lifetime building, Frank told her that putting his own son in a courtroom wasn't going to put the cabinets back where they belonged, and that it wouldn't teach him anything his mother's letter hadn't already taught him, far better than any judge ever could. What Daniel lost instead turned out to be something far harder to measure, and in its own quiet way, far more permanent than any prison sentence. Marla left him for 4 months, while she decided whether she could genuinely stay married to a man capable of doing what she had personally watched him do to his own father. She eventually came back, but she has said openly that the trust between them had to be rebuilt from far lower ground than it had ever stood on before, and that she hadn't married a con man, she had married a man who let his own fear turn him into one for a little while, which she considers a different thing to forgive entirely, not necessarily easier, just different. 6 weeks after the sale was formally reversed, Frank Whitmore moved back into the house he had built with his own 2 hands nearly 50 years earlier. Claire moved in alongside him, requesting a transfer to a hospice closer to Millbrook, no longer willing to let 3 hours of distance be the reason she missed what was happening to her own father ever again. Daniel began visiting too, though this time he never once brought a folder with him. Instead, he spent the better part of the following year rebuilding drywall and cabinetry in that house himself, entirely unpaid, working quietly alongside a father who watched him in near total silence for the first several weekends, before slowly, carefully, beginning to hand him tools again. There was one afternoon, months into that slow rebuilding, when Daniel finally admitted to his father that he didn't know how to make any of this right again. Frank told him simply that he didn't need to make it right all at once, that he just needed to keep showing up honest for longer than he had ever been dishonest, and that this was the whole trick to it, one his own mother had understood far better than either of them ever had. On the 1-year anniversary of that letter being opened, Frank drove out to the cemetery alone for the very first time since his hospital stay, bringing Eleanor's letter with him, and read it aloud to her the exact same way he used to read her the morning newspaper over coffee for 51 straight years. When he finished reading the line about protecting their son, but protecting the house first, he told her quietly that she had managed to do both, exactly the way she always did. She had simply made him do the difficult part himself this time. Frank Whitmore never got his original kitchen back, looking exactly the way it once had, and there are some things, once torn out of a life, that simply don't return in quite the same shape again. But what he did get, in the end, was something Eleanor's letter had never actually promised him outright, and might not even have been able to promise: a son who finally understood what he had almost thrown away forever, and a real chance, however imperfect, to build something honest between them again, one board at a time, the same way Frank had built everything else that ever truly mattered to him. So we want to ask you directly, if you were sitting in Frank's position, would you have forgiven a son who did something like this to you? Or would you have pressed charges and let the law decide what happened next? Let us know exactly what you would have done down in the comments below. We read every single one of them. And if this story genuinely moved you the way we hope it did, stay close, because there's another true story waiting for you right after this one, about a family who believed a will was the final word on everything, when in reality, it turned out to be only the very beginning of theirs.